Hey buddy, my name's Gregory and welcome to the Season 2 finale of Tell Me More, the series where we explore the strange and unexplained. I always found the UFO phenomenon fascinating, but I was never really a big believer in aliens. I figured that doing this series would be a great way to familiarize myself with the subject and challenge my skepticism. But I really underestimated just how deep this rabbit hole went. I couldn't believe how much lore was involved in this. There's a huge UFO community that's revealed a complex narrative over the decades, and I was a little bit naive to it. As the series progressed, I thought it was really interesting how all the pieces seemed to fit together, how every story led into the next, the drama with all the characters involved. I really started getting into it. I thought it was really fun, a fascinating ride. I even started believing some of it. And this season, I've covered some of the most iconic stories, like that famous weather balloon UFO crash that started it all in 1947. We even covered deep underground military bases, the secrets within, the characters involved in the exposure and research around them, the disinformation artists who were sent in to throw people off the scent, the tailcoat riders who came in at the last minute and hijacked the entire narrative, presenting themselves as heroes. We discussed the story of the little green men who landed in a farmer's field and harassed a family of carnival folk in an old shack. We went over the Men in Black and the stories of their threats against people who claimed to witness UFOs. We discussed a famous disappearing, teleporting ship in 1943. We remembered the anniversary of 7 giant lights floating over a densely populated desert city in the shape of a boomerang. And we talked about Antarctica, Project High Jump led by Admiral Byrd and his enormous contingent of troops that he took down there with him. When I was in the middle of researching this series, I came across an old article from the early days of the internet called the Krill Report that shone a whole new light on the UFO phenomenon, and it totally ruined the ride for me. Recently, the United States government passed a bill that requires their departments to disclose all of their information about the UFO phenomenon by June of this year. So what does that mean for us? Are we finally going to be told the truth about aliens? John Peniston's UFO encounter at the Twin Bases in the UK in 1980, this is the most perfect UFO story of all time. Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston was the on-duty flight chief at Woodbridge Base, enjoying a midnight stack, when he received a phone call that Airman First Class Cabinsang was on his way to pick him up. 2 military police officers told Peniston a bizarre story about seeing lights in the forest and believed they might have a problem. Peniston edged closer to the vehicle, noting an electrical charge in the air that made his hair stand on end. He was able to make out something metallic on the ground, describing it as a smooth, shiny, black, triangular object. White light was emitting from the top and the bottom, but I find it really hard to believe any of the narrative in this story. You see, usually when something paranormal or supernatural happens, the UFO believers come out of the woodwork and say that they believe that this was a UFO, and the military retorts back, denying and debunking those claims. We have credible, sensible witnesses on duty, presumably not under the influence. Multiple people witnessing this phenomenon from different angles, including radar images and photographs, including somebody who reached out and touched the craft. Already, this sounds like a pretty convincing case on that merit alone. But for some reason, this is the one case when it's the military that told us that it was a UFO. Why would they do this? What the hell was going on? One of the biggest red flags is that they had upwards of 50 years to comply with the Freedom of Information Act request. But it was like they couldn't wait to get the story out there, and they released it in like 3 years. It's actually because of Lieutenant Colonel Halt that this case became such a well-known incident at all. He wrote a memorandum to the Ministry of Defense at the behest of the British base commander. It found its way into the public domain after an American UFO research group used the Freedom of Information Act in 1983 to have it declassified. And they allowed their servicemen to be interviewed by CNN telling the entire story. What? I found interviews where witnesses claimed that one of these craft landed on the ground and 3 little men got out.
At that point we saw people, or whatever you want to call them, coming out. They didn't come out. There were no doors or anything on this ship. These things moved out. There were 3 of them, and they were covered with, they had light around them. They came out, they stood there, and they actually floated.
To hear such bold claims made by the military is troubling. Obviously, something else was going on that night. On the 3rd day after Lieutenant Colonel Holt's personal encounter, he sent a team with Geiger counters out to where Peniston had witnessed the phenomenon, and they found that some of the areas were radioactive. Something dropped in the woods, leaving a radioactive signal. And because there were no officers there because of the holiday, you know, officers sworn to an oath of secrecy, they had to come up with some crazy cover story to explain what the servicemen saw that night. Lieutenant Colonel Holt, confined by security oaths, refuses to disclose if the storage areas that the UFOs had been seen beaming lights into contained nuclear weapons or not. The highest ranking person there was Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston, who, if you remember, was the only one who supposedly saw the UFO up close. Bud Steffens didn't want to join the others in investigating the lights. He was shaken up by the initial sighting and refused to go. Radio communications began to fail, so he ordered Cabin Sang to go back to the vehicle and for Burroughs to stay at the tree line to maintain communications. But Burroughs, frozen in fear, failed to acknowledge the order, and so communications with the base were lost. Nobody else even approached it, which is a huge red flag to me. The hardest pill to swallow is Jim Peniston's notebook. The runes that he drew were suspicious enough, but the binary code is like something from a sci-fi. Staff Sergeant Peniston was seeing a series of 1s and 0s being projected into his mind's eye. He wrote it all down in his notebook, along with drawings of the hieroglyphs that he saw on the craft. And upon completion, the images of the binary code stopped appearing to him. I find it so hard to believe that Jim Peniston wrote several pages of binary code, left it in a notebook under his mattress for over 30 years without even thinking about it. I mean, sure, it's plausible that he didn't know what binary was, which is what he says, but as a serviceman, he would have been vividly familiar with Morse code, which ultimately, if you think about it, it's also just a series of 1s and 0s, so he should have been able to figure out that it was some sort of a language. The story goes that Jim was showing the runes in his notebook to somebody in the early 2010s, and this person noticed the binary code in there, asking him what it was, and he pushed him to decode it. But that story might not hold up because there's another eyewitness account that claims that they saw that same notebook in the early 2000s, and there was no binary code in it. So I don't really know what to believe here. Antarctica is up there with Göbekli Tepe in terms of its mystery, like this artifact that looks like a spaceship crash-landed on the side of a mountain, and multiple circular grids that look like collapsed domes of ice, or these pyramids? Then there's the almost perfect square in the ice. I can't explain that one. The Antarctic Treaty is one of the most successful treaties on the planet. Because the world doesn't agree on much these days, I don't think that it's insignificant that they all agree to leave Antarctica alone. Why is this the one thing that the entire world agrees on? It's incredible how quickly the landscape can change there, telling us that there could be so much under the ice that we wouldn't even guess. Over 15 million years ago, the continent used to be forested, filled with life, trees, animals, lakes, rivers. It is possible that a lot of that is still perfectly preserved 5 kilometers down. Some of the theories around Antarctica are among the most believable that I've covered in this series. In 1946, the United States military sent over 4,000 troops, 13 ships, and 25 aircraft to Antarctica for Operation High Jump. The official story is that it was an exploratory expedition with the purpose of mapping unknown regions of the continent. Operation High Jump was clearly a lot more than just a simple scientific survey mission. The Navy could have been down there for so many reasons. In the last months of the operation, Admiral Byrd and 100 troops stayed on the island alone, operating 4 planes, taking photos of the island from the sky every day. I'm sure that part of it was to determine how viable it would be to have a permanent military presence down there, because if the Americans could do it, that would mean that their enemies could do it too. Which is why I think the true purpose of the expedition was to look for a German military presence. The United States military sent a group of 500 men on a second expedition known as Operation Windmill. They found that Tent City was mostly buried under snow. Only the very tops of the tents were sticking out, along with the stovepipes. The fuel trucks were buried up to the tops of their tanks, and the planes were encased in ice. When they realized that their base got buried in only a couple of months, and that they couldn't maintain effective operations without a steady supply chain, they probably came to the realization that the Germans wouldn't have been able to either. And if they were still there, they wouldn't last much longer, so they packed up and left. There's a theory that Eisenhower was actually in a secret meeting with aliens. The UFO community tells a story about a peace deal, an exchange of technology. It was only a few years later that Dwight D. Eisenhower pushed to negotiate the Antarctic Treaty. That would explain all the secrecy around the island and why nobody wants to fight over the resources somebody else might already own. If there were people or aliens living on the continent before it froze over millions of years ago, there might still be remnants of that civilization intact under the ice. The rumors of aliens in Antarctica is quite exciting. According to some, the true mission of Admiral Byrd was to hunt down UFOs. A few former military officers have pointed out that they believe that they can see entrances to tunnels, where they think there might be a network of underground caverns where aliens operate secret bases. And there are countless locations that they could be hiding in down there. Quite a few compelling caves and caverns, even a few interesting ice structures. But the evidence for aliens on Antarctica is kind of weak. Admiral Byrd participated in multiple Arctic and Antarctic expeditions. He was one of the first people to fly a plane over the North Pole. He was also one of the first to fly a survey mission over the South Pole. A lot of that lore comes from a supposed lost diary of Admiral Byrd that was published a few years ago that details a story of him going into the center of the Earth through a hole in Antarctica and finding a brand new land. Apparently, he flew a plane through a hole into the center of the Earth, discovered that it's hollow, so the account goes that he flew his plane past the pole and found an oasis, a warm region that was full of lakes, rivers, and life. Green everywhere. Then from there, flew his plane through the hole into the center of the Earth, observed with his own eyes that it was hollow, and then flew out. And this obscure Chilean article where Admiral Byrd supposedly was quoted talking about a strange craft that was able to fly from pole to pole at tremendous speed, warning everybody that they could easily take over the Earth. It sounds like aliens, sure, but I don't know. I'm pretty sure that the article is fake. There are a lot of details in the story that I'm pretty skeptical of, but like I said, this is one of the more believable stories that I covered, and I'd really like to know more about it. Maybe he did find UFOs down there. I also told the story of a group of green goblins that landed their spaceship in a farmer's field and harassed a family. Billy Ray first saw a bright light that approached from the southwest of where he was standing. As it got closer, he saw a large disc-shaped object that had different colored rainbow streaks streaming from the rear. They saw something beginning to stir in the tree line. Some sort of a strange creature. The boys turned and ran back to the house. They grabbed a couple of weapons. Apparently, they got into a firefight for several hours before eventually abandoning the home, running to the police and filing a report. The boys stepped off the porch and fired multiple rounds into the entity at practically point-blank range. The shots made a noise like they were hitting an empty metal bucket. This was what was to be the beginning of a 3-hour siege with the creatures, appearing and disappearing on the roof and the trees, being shot repeatedly without apparent injury. With this story, you could just easily dismiss it, saying that the witnesses were simply lying. But the problem with that is that you could apply that logic to basically every story in this series. That's not the point of this series. Naturally, the police were pretty shocked by their story. 8 seemingly sober adults rushed to the police station at 11 p.m. on a Sunday night, claiming to have seen a UFO land in their field. and subsequently 15 seemingly invincible aliens try to invade their home for 3 hours straight? I get comments on like every episode of Tell Me More, asking me why I'm not being more skeptical, assuming that I'm crazy for not just assuming that these witnesses are lying. The police decided to take their story seriously because the emotional state that they were in indicated that something must have happened at the Sutton house that night, with Sheriff Greenwell saying, "These are not the sorts of people who normally run to the police." Something frightened them. Something beyond their comprehension. Imagine how short this series would be if I just used that argument every time. I mean, I'm the Armored Skeptic, for Christ's sake. I don't go into these stories assuming that they're true. I find most of them pretty improbable, if not impossible. In total, about 20 law enforcement personnel were sent to the Sutton home to investigate. After the police left, the family started to settle down for bed when they heard a scratching sound on the roof. When they went to investigate, they once again saw one of these creatures staring at them through the window. But thousands of people around the world every year report similar supernatural events, and they can't all be lying. It seems that the police had no interest in making sense of what the family had witnessed that night, instead mocking them, accusing them of being drunk on moonshine, and also going as far as to claim that they had seen monkeys that had escaped from a nearby circus, with no proof that any of those things were true. Accusing people of being liars is just dismissive. I want to treat each of these eyewitness accounts with sincerity. Hynek claims that he personally believes that this story did actually take place, that he personally believes the testimony of the family. And though he doesn't come to any conclusions about what they've witnessed, he says that the family did see something that night. The game that we play with Tell Me More is to find logical explanations that either explain why the witnesses saw what they saw, or explain why they were confused about it. Sure, we don't have a lot of reason to trust that the witnesses were telling the truth. I mean, they were carnival folk, which at the time, they were not really considered honest people. They might have been intoxicated and bored. But on the flip side of that, we have to ask, why would they lie? Why would they expose themselves and put themselves out there like this? Why would they go to the police to make a report when even the police made a comment that these don't seem like the kind of people that would go to the police? One argument that I didn't put in the video is that they may have been trying to get their mother out of that house, so they made up a story about being attacked and harassed by supernatural beings as an excuse to get her off of her lease or her mortgage or whatever. No tracks, no blood, no markings, no damage to the property. There was apparently a single patch of glowing earth that the police spent some time looking at, and apparently a green glow coming from the woods, but the police chalked that up to foxfire, which is a type of mushroom that bioluminesces. The problem is that there's no evidence that this even happened at all, except for the spent shells on the ground. So functionally, I have to dismiss this as unsubstantiated. But for some reason, at the end of the day, I kind of believe that this story is at least somewhat true. I feel like something happened that night that can't be explained. In fact, one of the daughters of the witnesses, Geraldine Sutton Stith, wrote a book about the event and also goes on tour talking about it, saying that when her father would recall the story, it wasn't a novelty to him. It wouldn't make him laugh or smile. In fact, he would get pale in the face when he would tell the story. This was the height of the cryptid era, only a few years after the Flatwoods Monster and about a decade before Mothman and Patty the Sasquatch. You could say that this was the height of the era when people were making up crazy stories about monsters in the woods. Or you could say that this was an era when a lot of crazy cryptids were manifesting somehow. Why were so many strange alien-like creatures being seen during this time? What was going on? The Seven Lights in the shape of a triangle in 1997 is not only the largest UFO ever recorded, but was the largest mass sighting of all time. On May 13th, 1997, in the state of Arizona, a set of 7 giant amber lights were seen. These lights were lined up in a triangular boomerang shape, each perfectly equidistant from each other, less than 2,000 feet above the ground, and was dead silent. Many more people in Arizona Arizona saw these lights than any other mass UFO sighting in modern history. I know that it seems on the surface that this story's been debunked, and I'd love to believe that too, but the problem is that most of the skeptical arguments for these lights are pretty weak. Even the police lied, quoting to the media that very few people called in about the lights that night, which wasn't true. Hundreds of people called in to report what they saw that night. The videos that I showed you last week are apparently not really what people were even seeing that night, but thousands of eyewitnesses claimed to see the exact same thing. 5 or 7 giant, bright orange lights that were in a perfect equidistant formation from each other, slowly floating over the city. And it drifted from northwest to southeast all the way across the state, and they were extremely close to the ground, only a couple hundred feet from the surface. The lights were large, amber orange, very bright, and appeared as if they were deep set inside of something. A handful of people reported seeing a V-shaped craft that these lights were attached to. A few witnesses said the craft was somewhat transparent, like they could see the outline of the ship, but the stars were somewhat visible through it. And other witnesses said that the craft was completely blocking out the stars in the night sky. Flares always fall in a somewhat random pattern. They can end up in a perfect V shape, but the chances of them staying like that for a long time as they drift across a large distance is next to impossible. The wind almost always carries them in slightly different directions as they fall at slightly different rates. A formation of planes doesn't really explain that, because planes wouldn't have giant orange lights. And a series of flares doesn't explain that either, because flares kind of float away from each other. They don't stay equidistant in a perfect triangular formation. Quite a few people came out of this story, not only becoming professional UFO advocates, but also ended up spouting the same crap about achieving world peace and ending pollution. And those are good things, don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking the message, but it's just so stereotypical of UFO witnesses. I can't help but feel that they're all just playing it up, trying to breathe life into something that doesn't really have legs to stand on. This doesn't need to be aliens, though. In fact, I don't really trust the people who keep pushing that narrative as a necessary explanation for this phenomenon. I mean, this probably is the best evidence for aliens that we have on Earth today, but I don't need that answer to believe that this was true. I believe that something did happen that night, and it was definitely not something that's within the knowledge of the average person. But because we don't know for sure that it was aliens, Occam's razor requires us to look at things that we do know that can explain this. There's also the possibility that this was early drone technology. Drones today can fly in extremely intricate formations, making any shape you want. To someone who's never seen this before, this would look impossible. So if this was something man-made, maybe something that the Air Force built, we have to ask the question, why did they fly this over such a densely populated city? Was that on purpose, or was that a mistake? It's possible that this is some sort of secret stealth technology, something that's essentially supposed to cloak, but something went wrong with the masking device, making it partially visible over the city. And the eyewitness accounts make that seem like that's exactly the case, as so many people said that the ship was partially see-through. Perhaps the military was testing a top-secret technology on the population of Phoenix, creating holographic projections in the sky, an illusion device, an airborne holographic projector that can create images in mid-air. But it's possible that this was on purpose, a display made to trick us into thinking that aliens are real, a display of secret technology that makes us think that it was out of this world because it's not something that we humans could have built. A larger-than-life craft appears in our skies. The Air Force denies that it even exists, even though they scrambled a few jets to intercept it. That would be a really effective misdirection technique. Stealth technology, hidden in plain sight? Or this could have all been a test to see what would happen if a giant UFO appeared in the sky one night, determine if it would cause mass panic. What you might call a psychological operation. Regardless, I believe that something unprecedented happened that night, and we have to accept the possibility that it might be aliens. The biggest problem that I have with this story is the way that the media disseminated the information. I'm so confused by the way that these things are discussed in the media. Speaking of the media, Amumua is in the news cycle again for like the 4th time. In 2017, astronomers announced that for the first time in recorded history, an object from outside of our solar system was falling towards the sun. Apparently they're saying that scientists are now quite confident that Amumua is cookie-shaped, but we already knew that possibility for like 2 or 3 years now. This isn't news.
So now we have to rethink what it may look like. And as shown in this beautiful painting by space artist Bill Hartman, we think that Oumuamua may be more of a flattened oval.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was in the shape of a disc? Has anybody ever heard of that before? A shiny disc flying through space. Am I the first one to ever hear about this? Why do they want us thinking about Oumuamua so much? Why is this in the media so often? Several articles were released promoting a Harvard professor, Avi Loeb, who claims that he believes that this was a discarded piece of alien technology. Space garbage from another civilization. Obviously, the debate is this a piece of space debris from a destroyed planet after a supernova? Or is this an artificially designed craft that was intentionally or accidentally sent on a trip around our sun?
We believe it's a natural object, but we can't actually prove that it's not something artificial.
The artist's rendition of the comet makes it look like the Millennium Falcon or like a flying saucer, and I don't think that that's an accident. That's what they want us to think it is. Between their insistence on reminding us that this exists and their constant quoting of Harvard professor Avi Loeb, who says that he's pretty convinced that it's aliens, I think that they want us to think that this is aliens. But why? The object was also much shinier than it should have been. It reflected a lot more light than a typical comet would. After it slungshot around the sun, it sped up a lot. Like, way too much. The only explanation that makes sense for what we observed in 2017 is aliens. Now, I'm not saying that it's aliens, but it's aliens. I know that I'm going against the grain here, but I don't think that this is aliens. In fact, the constant coverage and insistence upon this being aliens is actually pushing me away from the idea of extraterrestrial visitors at all. It's actually kind of frustrating me about the subject. The teleporting ship story seems implausible, but I can't really shake the feeling that there's something to this story. When the technology was activated, the ship was enveloped by a glowing green fog, and in only a few seconds, the ship completely disappeared from sight. Not just radar invisible, not just invisible to the naked eye, the ship was completely gone. A Navy sailor claimed to see the USS Eldridge appear a few miles off of his ship. It was observed for some time before it once again disappeared. It's kind of unreal how this whole thing started. A ufologist writes a book about things in the sky that disappear, and then he gets random letters in the mail one day saying, "Oh, you like things that disappear? How about this ship that disappeared?" Which he initially writes off as the words of a crackpot, until one day the Navy shows up at his door asking him what he knows about all this. And then a few short years later, after he figures it out, he turns up dead. The Navy made a concerted effort to hide this story from the public, and that has to count for something, right? For some reason, the Navy seemed to get really nervous about UFO author Morris K. Jessup's knowledge of electromagnetic propulsion and the seemingly crazy ramblings of Carl Allen, who claimed to be a former Navy sailor who witnessed the experiment. Several of the crew members were wandering around aimlessly, unresponsive, devoid of their personalities. Other members of the crew were found fused to the hull, moaning in agony, the atoms of their bodies having passed partially through the bulkheads of the ship, permanently affixing them to the metal, as it seemed to lead into so many other areas of study. For example, the sailors on the ship seemed to lose their mind because of the effects of the field, which apparently led into the beginning of MK Ultra, and also the teleportation of the ship led into time travel and teleportation experiments in Montauk, New York, both of which part of the Montauk Project. In 1955, Jessup received 2 letters in the mail from a man calling himself Carlos Miguel Allende, claiming that during his time as a seaman in the United States Navy, witnessed a top-secret World War II operation. Jessup initially ignored these claims, believing Allende to be a crackpot. However, in 1957, Jessup was contacted by the Office of Naval Research, claiming that they received a copy of one of his books in the mail, but it had been heavily annotated. Jessup was interviewed by the Navy about this package, asking him what he knew about all of this electromagnetic transportation stuff. After the story died down, a group of bizarre characters came out of nowhere and claimed that they were former time travelers who were part of the subsequent projects. I'm extremely skeptical of this story. This band of misfits seemed to cook up this narrative behind the leadership of Al Bielek, a man who claimed to be on the ship when it teleported, not only several hundred miles to another port, but 40 years into the future in 1983. We know for a fact that deep underground military bases exist. They're real. The question is, why does the military need so many of them? And what is it that they're doing down there that can't see the light of day? The first real-world underground base that comes to mind, of course, is Cheyenne Mountain Complex, also known as America's Fortress. This secure facility used to be home to NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and boasts miles of tunnels, as well as containing 13 3-story buildings and 2 12-story buildings within its confines. I find D.U.M.B.S so fascinating, and we know that there's some sort of drama behind them because for the past few years, troops have been receiving training on how to conduct combat missions in these facilities. But they're likely also used to maintain continuity of government, meaning if there's some sort of a catastrophe, world leaders can be whisked away to these deep underground military bases to maintain their rule. There's a rumor that there's just such a base that was secretly built under a certain international airport. The Antarctica Treaty came into effect in June of 1961. The Cheyenne Mountain Complex began construction in May of 1961 and was finished in 1966. A bizarre coincidence? The idea of there being aliens down there is pretty intriguing, and if it's true, we basically all have to accept that it's impossible for us to prove it. But I'm not really sold on the underground alien thing. In Eisenhower's farewell speech at the White House on the 17th of January, he made some bold claims. He described a threat to democracy he called the military-industrial complex. But there's certainly a connection between deep underground military facilities, secret technology, and those bizarre cattle extractions that were being perpetrated in the 1970s. And now for the story of Phil Schneider and the D.U.M.B.S. The very first case of cattle mutilation was reported on the D.U.M.B.S ranch. This was to be the first of many cases of a similar nature that New Mexico State Trooper Gabe Valdez started documenting, stating, quote, "It has to be somebody doing it." Retired State Trooper Gabe Valdez made it quite clear that he discovered in his investigations that these kinds of surgeries were being conducted out of these underground facilities. In an interview from 2011, he claimed to have found evidence of human involvement, such as gas masks, glow sticks, and radar shaft. In one of the last interviews he did before he died, he said that he personally didn't believe that there were aliens involved in this, and that he thinks that someone or some group wanted to make us believe that aliens were responsible. I can't help but notice that we're often led to believe that aliens are behind stories like this. It's like alien is a code word used to sweep the moral implications of secret operations under the carpet so that we don't think about it too much, like a magic trick. Paul Benowitz also believed that he was intercepting radio signals and messages from the Archuleta Mesa area, and believed that they were communicating in a hexadecimal code. Piecing all of this together led him to conclude that people were being abducted and tagged with implants. There's a secret underground facility near Dulce, northwestern New Mexico, under the Archuleta Peak. The cattle mutilations were associated with Sandia National Labs, and the people responsible for conducting the cattle mutilations and human abductions were, in fact, gray aliens. If you realize that it's humans performing these surgeries on cattle and you stop to think about it, you'll start to wonder what could justify these kinds of barbaric practices. And the truth is, we're not really prepared to hear the answers to questions like that. He actually reached out to the United States Air Force to tell them what he had discovered, and they sent 2 officers to his house. And the Air Force got nervous about this, probably not because they thought it was something out of this world, but because they didn't realize that their covert signals could be picked up by civilians. Operatives were sent to defuse Paul Bennewitz by, quote, pumping as much disinformation to him as he could absorb, to confuse him and make his information useless. One thing that I absolutely believe about this story is the testimony of Richard Doty, who claimed to work for the Air Force as a disinformation agent, tasked with pretending to help Paul Bennewitz determine the source of these bizarre radio signals that he was picking up on his sensitive homemade equipment. Months of interacting with Richard Doty ultimately led to Paul Bennewitz suffering a mental breakdown. In fact, that is the only thing that Richard Doty has said that I believe. But during this, Richard Doty directed Paul Bennewitz to the entrance of a secret underground facility in the mountains. Investigative journalist Linda Moulton Howe. In 1980, she created a documentary called A Strange Harvest. After Paul Bennewitz had gone public with his information, Moulton Howe had signed a contract with HBO to create a film featuring Paul Bennewitz and his D.U.M.B.S theory as her primary source. Linda Moulton Howe was approached by Richard Doty, offering to help her with her research by giving her what he called presidential papers. However, Bennewitz had another mental breakdown, causing HBO to pull the plug on the project. Bennewitz would ultimately end up in a mental facility, and Richard Doty seems to show no remorse for pushing him there. But where this story gets interesting is with the testimony of Phil Schneider. Having claimed to have worked in one of these underground facilities in the 70s, Phil joined the UFO lecture circuit in the early 90s. First, Phil claims that his father was a German U-boat captain who was captured by the U.S. in 1941 and participated in the Philadelphia Experiment Project. His father didn't tell this to anyone in his family, including Phil, until just before his death. He became famous after he turned up dead in his room one night after claiming that he was targeted for assassination. Spooky, right? Phil says that there was some kind of problem that required him to be lowered down into the hole to investigate. He stepped out of the lift, and out of nowhere appeared a gray alien. Phil, out of fear for his life, shot the alien down, but more aliens appeared. Before he knew it, this ended up leading to the so-called Dulce War of 1979. Phil claims that he got into a firefight with aliens in one of these underground facilities, but that's kind of awkward because that means that he stayed quiet during the height of the covert cattle surgeries in the 70s and 80s and completely stayed out of the Paul Bennewitz drama. Why? Phil started in the lecture circuit after initially approaching Al Bielek, a man who claimed he was part of the infamous Philadelphia experiment. Phil told Al that his father was part of the Philadelphia experiment as well, and that connection eventually led Al to convincing Phil to tour with his own incredible story. Why didn't Phil come forward earlier and give his testimony to somebody credible who was already involved in the story, like Linda Moulton Howe? Why did he wait 20 years to give his story and tell it to, of all people, Al Bielek at a UFO convention? And Al, likely being a liar, knew that Phil was full of shit, but his answer to that was to convince him to follow him and come along to do lectures on the UFO circuit as well. Phil may have just inserted himself at this pivotal point in the story, making himself the instigator and survivor of an alien-human war for lecture clout at Bigfoot conferences. The thing is, his story about the Dulce War wasn't even original. Paul Bennewitz told us about the Dulce War in 1984. This could all just very well be part of the disinformation that was fed to him by the likes of Bill Moore and Richard Doty. The sad truth is that Phil Schneider was likely a mentally unwell man who spun a strange story to make his physical condition seem more special. Phil's own family didn't even really believe him. His ex-wife said that he would often make up fantastical stories. That was just the kind of guy he was. Phil just wanted to seem important important and gain some clout within the UFO community, of which he was a fan. Phil was surrounded by people who took advantage of his mental condition and allowed him to spiral out of control just to give credibility to their own crazy stories about being involved in secret military projects. There's nothing to say that Phil Schneider couldn't have just created his narrative around the information that was already available on the forums and chat rooms of the early days of the internet. Which brings us finally to the Krill Report. I found this about a month ago when I was coming to the tail end of my research into the UFO phenomenon. The Krill Report comes from the early years of the internet, the 1980s, and lays out a narrative regarding ufology, men in black, aliens, and secret military technology. And like I said at first, I was really getting into this article. I thought it was fun and interesting to see an early UFO community's take on the alien and UFO phenomenon. It includes stories about the military's involvement in secret UFO technology and their efforts to suppress knowledge about it, the aliens that supposedly hold power here on Earth and their secret facilities and underground bases. But the more I read the Krill Report, the more I realized that it was in no way based on any kind of reality. Not only did most of the information seem to come completely out of thin air, none of it had sources, but it seemed like it was just a story that was spun to entertain UFO enthusiasts, a story that was taken way too seriously. I caught wise to this when I realized their heavy dependence on mentioning characters within the UFO community that I know for a fact are either disinfo artists or unreliable swindlers, like John Keel. I mentioned John Keel in the Mothman series, explaining that he would roll into a town after a mass UFO or alien sighting and start poking around, manipulating the perception the locals have of the event, spinning stories, creating false narratives to play against the narrative that the Air Force pushed, creating a false dichotomy that confuses people, making it difficult to figure out the truth. Seeing references like this used over and over again in the Krill Report made me realize that the entire popular UFO narrative was created as a distraction, or maybe just entertainment. Maybe it was created to give supernaturally minded people something to occupy their brains, maybe to distract them from ever finding out the truth about the UFO phenomenon. You know how Star Trek and Star Wars fans are super anal about maintaining continuity within the story? Well, the UFO community is exactly the same. It's filled with false prophets who are vividly aware of the popular narrative, who want to present themselves as heroes within their own stories that fit perfectly within the existing lore. When comparing Phil Schneider's story about an underground alien war to the Krill Report, it becomes so obvious that he derived most of his narrative from this article. In fact, I think it's obvious that most of the popular characters within the UFO community have done the same thing. And because the Krill Report was so obscure back then, being from the early years of the internet, it's unlikely that most people would have even caught on to this. And likely most of the people who knew that the Krill Report existed were firm believers in that narrative anyways. And I got thinking about how the Krill Report fits in with the UFO narrative when I came across a series of articles that were just published recently, stating that the Pentagon is about to release a report highlighting some of the more difficult to explain UFO encounters. If you've been paying attention to the media lately, the Pentagon has been slowly drip-feeding us footage of bizarre UFO encounters from the Air Force and the Navy. The UFO community is pretty sure that this is the beginning of disclosure, a future where we get to know that aliens exist, a future where we have relations on an intergalactic scale. So I ask again, why is the media pushing so hard to get us to believe in aliens? Why was the Space Force just formed as the latest branch of the US military? Why is the UFO community being vindicated in their belief about aliens? Because if this is what we're about to be sold in the future, I have to admit here that I'm going to be completely unable to trust that this disclosure is true. I feel like we're about to be sold a lie. I mean, if there's a massive UFO invasion tomorrow and the media tells us that aliens are here to take over the Earth, and the story that they spin just so happens to perfectly match up with the popular UFO community narrative, I'm not going to be able to trust that this is true, because I already know that this story is based on bullshit. I already know where this narrative comes from. I already know that it's based on a creepypasta written in the 80s without any sources. I feel like we're being conditioned to think about the UFO phenomenon in a specific way as a misdirection to keep us from understanding what it really is. I don't believe in aliens, but if an alien appeared in front of me right now, I would accept that he was real, but I wouldn't be able to trust that he is who he says he is, that he represents what I'm told he represents. You know what I'm saying? I mean, when disclosure comes, will disclosure really be disclosure? What does disclosure even mean at this point? What kind of story am I going to be sold? How am I supposed to trust the narrative that I'm told? Tell me what you guys think. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed Season 2 of Tell Me More. I know the alien subject's a little bit heavy. I'll see you guys back here in a couple weeks after a brief break with Season 3. Here's a brief preview of what you can expect to see.
The new millennium is going to be a time when we are going to open up many of the secrets of life. Cameras don't lie, recorders don't lie, credible people don't lie. This is what we have as evidence.
We wanted to get deeper into this case, yes. We definitely want. We went up there so many times.
The apparitions, diabolical. Do they exist? Positively. Nobody could come to us today and say, show us your proof that there's a supernatural world, that's a preternatural world. We have that evidence. We have film. We have recordings. As I said, people who are beyond suspicion of creating hoaxes. There's no reason for them to create a hoax. They call the Amityville Horror a hoax. There was no hoax. This is the atheists. These are the people that don't want anybody to believe that such a thing as a haunted house exists or a ghost. Simply because if you believe that, you're going to believe there's spirits. God is a spirit. Angels are spirits, right? So they don't want you to believe in haunted houses or devils or demons because then you'll believe in God, the Creator.
Subscribe to my vlog channel, Armored Gregory, where I make follow-up videos responding to some of my favorite comments. And also check out my new podcast, Full Metal Tuxedo, where my co-writer Patrice and I talk more about the kind of stuff we talk about on this series, the strange and unexplained. And of course, I have to thank my patrons and channel members for supporting my content. I couldn't do this without you. You're amazing.